Hey there, welcome to All About Your Benjamins for the RLS Wealth Rundown Week in Review video. I hope you had a great week. I know this is getting out a little bit later than usual, but I did not want to skip it. We had a busy weekend. Today was busier as well, but there were enough headlines I wanted to record a video to hit on. Down below in the rundown, you'll see a write-up about the U.S. credit rating getting cut. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but I did not want to address it the week that it happened because I wanted to let it play out. I did not think in the short term it was going to cause a big issue, but I wanted to give it time before I reacted and not bring more attention to it than necessary. So there's a nice little write-up in the rundown. Check that out. But let's get to the headlines that may or may not be impacting your financial plan and portfolio. And we're going to start with the inflation number. So in July, the number actually ticked up a little bit, but another core number actually went down. So the way they track inflation is interesting. So in July, it was actually at 3.2%, up a little bit from 3%, but one of the other metrics was down. So overall, it's still showing that inflation is cooling. And the article that I was reading through in the Wall Street Journal just talked about how this cool inflation number should hopefully give the Fed some room to pause on raising rates again. So we know they raised last month. We'll find out what they do this month, but another cool number may give them the freedom they need or the flexibility they need to pause on raising the rates this month. So we'll have to take a look at that. And something we haven't talked about in a while, but if you remember, there's been a lot of talk about inverted yield curves over the last couple of years. The inverted yield curve is when short-term interest rates are higher than long-term interest rates. And that's not normally what we see because typically if you're going to invest your money or lend your money, you need to be compensated more the longer you're going to give that money away. Meaning, if I'm going to give you my money for a long period of time, you better compensate me more because I'm going without my funds. So typically, long-term interest rates are higher than short-term interest rates. But when we have this inversion, it usually signals that the bond investors don't have as much faith in the organization. So in this situation, the U.S. government, for the long term, that they're not willing to lend their money out even at higher rates. They want it in the short term and it flips. And the reason people talk about this is an inverted yield curve usually precedes a recession. And whether or not that is actually a true statement, it's not if-then, I guess. If the yield curve inverts, then immediately we're going to have a recession. It's just saying that the sentiment is moving in that direction. And the reality of it is, no matter when an inverted yield curve happens, unless you're in the middle of a recession, it's going to precede the next recession. It's just how soon and when. So it's not that the inverted yield curve causes the recession. It's the inverted yield curve means we might be closer to a recession historically. The reason I bring this up is we're starting to see the long end of the curve begin to come up. So 10-year interest rates went up. They're above 4% now as of last week, and we're getting to a point where it's getting back to normalized. And the reason that is a positive is that may mean that bond investors are not as scared about the future of the U.S. government and getting back to some normal situations. But another reason is that they believe that the economy will be able to handle longer interest rates for a longer period of time so that the yield curve can get back to normal. And while having higher interest rates longer is not necessarily good if you're looking to get a mortgage or take out a loan, but for the savers out there, having higher interest rates for longer is a good thing. Now we have our money in cash earning something as opposed to earning nothing. You figure out how much you need to have in cash. That's between you and your financial advisor. But right now it looks like bond investors are getting more optimistic about the long term, despite the credit rating getting cut, about the long term of bond investing, and the yield curve is getting back more to normal. Speaking of the downgrade of the U.S. credit, we also had last week basically it's a bunch of regional banks get downgraded by Moody's. So Moody's is another. We have Fitch is one credit agency. Moody's is another. And S&P is another as well. So Moody's downgraded regional banks, which kind of impacted the market in the short term, but it's not something that is too terribly surprising if you look at the landscape of banking and where it's going and what the younger demographic wants from a bank versus what the older demographic wants from a bank. And as we see more young people coming into banking, these regional banks don't have the infrastructure that the larger banks have. So I think it's more of a case of the regional banks aren't built for the long-term growth potentially. And the downside to this would be not necessarily that these banks are going to go under, but that there's the possibility that they suffer enough to that the bigger banks come in and buy them, and now we're left with fewer large banks. And for some people, they don't want that. For others, it may not be a bad thing. We look north of the border. Canada only has a couple major banks, and their banking system seems to be fine. So, I already bank with Chase, which is already one of the bigger ones. So if they keep on growing, that doesn't impact me necessarily. But anyways, I wanted to bring that up because you hear downgradings of banks that might be nerve-wracking. It's regional banks, which you might bank with a regional bank. And it's not necessarily saying these banks are going to go the way of Silicon Valley Bank that we saw earlier this year, but it's just that they may not be as stable as they once were from a profitability standpoint, which impacts their rating. Again, I don't think this is a warning that these banks are going to go under, but maybe in the future these banks do get purchased by bigger banks as they cannot survive in the form that they're in today if they don't innovate. Moving into global international news, China slipped into a deflationary environment, which the article is saying could be warning signs for the global economy. So we know China is a large player in the global economy, and sliding into deflation, it's not necessarily where you want to be. Inflation's not great, deflation's not great. We want that perfect balance. But I just put that out there as it may be something you hear more about as time goes on. Not an indication of what's going to happen here, but again, they are a big player in the global economy, so it's something to be aware of and just know what's going on. Again, reason to be globally diversified, and whether or not you want to have exposure to China, that's another thing as well. And a lot of investing in China is harder to do these days, so it's not as if a lot of us have direct exposure to China, but it is potentially maybe signaling what could be on the forefront for some other countries around the world. And finally, since we don't always want to end with always news, I don't want these to be scary or to always be so news focused. Hip hop turned 50 last week, which is very exciting. Obviously, I'm a big hip hop fan, so to see the hip hop turn 50 and all of the celebration around it and the big concerts was really, really cool. So happy birthday to hip hop. All right, that's it for today's rundown. Hope you had a great week. Our boys started school last week, so if your kids are going back to school, hope they're having a great first week of school. If they're getting ready to go back, hopefully they enjoy that as well. And for those of you on the East Coast, I know school starting is a few weeks away. Hopefully you enjoy the last little bit of summer before they go back to school. All right, with that, we'll let you get to your day. Thanks for tuning in as always, and we'll see you all in the next one.